Hello, football family. Welcome into Huddle It Up Films. Today I have a very special guest once again. It's Jordan Kough from the Ravens Situation Room. And we're here to talk about 2020 and the expectations in 2021. Jordan, how you doing? And can you tell us a little bit about you and where people can find your work?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on, Jason. Excited to talk Ravens. Excited to get this season up and running. We're almost there. You guys can check us out. I'm on Twitter at Ravens Sit Room, and I've got a podcast. My co-host Gabe Ferguson. He's at Gabe Fergie. You guys can find that on filmstudyravens.com. We're hosted over there, and we're always excited to have other people tuning in.
It's a good listen, and I love Gabe too. I'm going to try to have him on as well. Hopefully that goes. He's a busy man. He's a very smart man like Jordan, and you guys are going to get a lot out of having them listen, being a listen to them. So I encourage you to go check Jordan and Gabe's workout over at the Situation Room. But going back to 2020, the expectations were really high. I mean, Lamar was coming off an MVP season, and the Ravens still went 11-5, and they won a playoff game. But somehow during the season, it felt like things were never clicking. Maybe towards the end when we ran off a bunch of wins against some pretty bad teams. But can you talk to us a little bit about the expectations that you had in 2020 and maybe some of the things that kind of worked against us?
Yeah, for sure. The more I think about the start of this upcoming season, the more I start thinking back to where things stood at the start of 2020. And I mean, Ravens fans were sky high in expectations, as they should have been. Only a couple major losses as we were heading into that season with Marshall Yanda not being there. This was pre kind of the Earl Thomas fiasco. But at that point, everybody had Super Bowl expectations for this team. A high level of expectations for Lamar. Even without the passing stuff. I mean, everybody saw what he did the year before that, and I think everyone's a little off kilter right now with expectations of. It just seems that everything has washed really far back in 2021, and some of that is hype around the Steelers. Some of that is Josh Allen improving and Buffalo improving. We've got Julio Jones now in the AFC. But it seems like it was really easily forgotten how good this Ravens team was in 2019 and the expectations of how they thought they were going to build on that into 2020. And so, I thought in particular there were some just kind of really peculiar things that happened. Obviously, one, I think COVID really set this team back in the sense that they weren't able to plus up that playbook and their game plans on top of what they were successful with in kind of 2020. And so really I think that little stuck in the mud kind of thing that you were talking about was the first 8 games of the year was the Ravens starting to install their offense, basically having the same offense they ran in 2019, teams adjusting. And for the first time, Greg Roman got the opportunity to kind of counter back. And
Right. And
no
just
pun
to
intended, but
just to yeah, just to interject there. I mean, that's a good point. Like on top of that, we have a young quarterback. I mean, we think about Lamar as being, MVP and established, but he's still really young going into that year. And like you said, we saw early last season teams flooding the edges, putting more safeties in the game. It seemed like they were just hell bent on stopping the read option, and without the offseason, a true offseason to build off of what we had done in 2019. I mean, that's a really good point. I think not having training camp, people don't realize that not having a full training camp and OTAs and everything kind of made this offense stay a little bit stagnant. And it took a while. I mean, we had to adjust to that with the counter bash and some of the other stuff that we were doing. And then by the time we finally figured it out, we didn't have personnel really at the X receiver to really stretch the field and challenge teams in any other way. So I appreciate that. And there were other things that went kind of didn't go our way last year as well, besides
yeah,
COVID.
one of them was weather. The Ravens had a peculiar year when it came down to the weather, right? If you look at back to that Patriots loss, that was just a really bizarre game and a really bizarre scenario where the Ravens were essentially forced to have to run the ball. And when any team is forced to kind of do one thing, even if they do it as well as the Ravens, it makes it a little tough to get by. And so that's kind of what it turned into. So we took a loss in that game. And then if you look back at the Buffalo game, it's too bad that there was such bad weather in that game too. Because it would have been really great to see what the Ravens corners and secondary could actually do against Josh Allen without kind of the wind affecting some of those throws. It was definitely affecting it, but it was also affecting Lamar and it was affecting what the Ravens were trying to do throwing the ball. I mean, they were doing well running. They set up the run for the pass early, but then they could never get into passing. And I don't think that was on Lamar. I think a lot of that ultimately ended up being attributed to the weather. And so, it's easy to like pick a spot here and there and say, oh, one game here, one game there. But in football, they say it's a game of interest for a reason. And so, you take those two bad weather games and you replace them with two completely different games, and the weather is fine in them. And I think there's a really good chance that the Ravens are in the AFC Championship game against Kansas City. Even, the Buffalo game is really blown out of proportion in my perspective too. Lamar didn't
Mhm.
play in the fourth quarter. The Ravens were still in that game when he got hurt and he went down. That included a pick six on the only interception that Lamar Jackson's thrown in the red zone. And so they were a lot closer to beating Buffalo than the way that kind of the narrative feels like it's written or the story is told after the fact now.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the final score really doesn't tell the story. One play here or there, and it's not to make excuses because stuff happens. I mean, I don't want it to come off as, "Hey, we shoulda." Should. I mean, that happens to every team, but at the same time, two things can be true, as you know. It just didn't break our way, and that's no reason to be. It doesn't have to be an excuse, but it's also a reason to look at 2021 and say, "Hey, the ball bounces our way just a little bit. We're right back to where we were. How that we had that feeling last year." So that's a good point. And then, yeah, the weather, and then we had some key injuries in there too. I mean, that's you can't really ignore. We couldn't really run the same offense with the injuries that we had.
No, it was a real problem. It was a real problem at tackle, and it was a real problem all across the offensive line. And I think that the Ravens didn't think Marshall Yanda was going to retire before the season, so they weren't completely ready for that on the offensive line either. And then it was just kind of full offensive line shuffle all throughout the season. Once Brown went
Right.
down, everybody's moving around. Had issues at center with the snaps, which was something that Skura never had a problem with before that. And so, it was just a really peculiar set of like those things coming together along with the Boyle injury. I think that ended up, I've been somewhat critical of the Ravens deal with Nick Boyle. I think you can find good blockers, at the tight end position, but they didn't have another blocker at his capability level to come in and continue to run the scheme that they needed at that level. I think a better blocking tight end helps you solve some of those issues at right tackle a little bit better as well. And so they just missed a few guys in what seemed like really critical spots there. On the offensive line that was just kind of really untimely. It was almost like a everything that could go wrong, would go wrong. And even thinking about it, I didn't even think about the second Pittsburgh game where essentially they had to punt that game. They didn't have the guys to play it. The league really should have just postponed the whole thing, and they had to play through that whole debacle as well. So just a lot of peculiarities happening to the Ravens last year.
And I think some of it was self inflicted by the Ravens. You know, Without Boyle, we didn't have another style to go to. And part of that goes back to what we said earlier about the lack of training camp, but also the lack of weapons. We had to spread it out with, we have Duvernay and Prochet who were rookies. Prochet wasn't even active towards the end of the season. And then, of course, losing Boyle, we had to move pretty much Ricard to Boyle's spot. You had Ricard blocking on the end. So it really limited our personnel. And then, of course, you didn't even mention Ronnie Stanley by name, even though you talk about the situation. I mean, just him himself, that's an all pro, one of the best left tackles in the game. So, coaching wise, I would have liked to have seen them stick with a solid five more often. I think that they were late to take Skura out when he was having problems. I think they should have had a better backup plan at right guard, right tackle, and center. So going into 2021, those are things that you have to feel a lot better about. Number one, the weapons that we added. That's not to mention the coaches. We're just better prepared, I think, overall in 2021 to run a lot of different things. But I mean, you look at the last 2 years, Jordan. We've had our offensive success pretty much speaks for itself, even with all the complaints that we have.
That's the thing that and it's not just Ravens fans that fall into this bucket, but it's definitely them too. But people act like this offense wasn't or isn't prolific already to begin with. I mean, if you and you can't do this, but if you take out the Pittsburgh game and the New England game during the regular season, I'm pretty sure that the Ravens had in terms of pace would have been the best scoring team in the league or close to it. You had these two really peculiar games where they couldn't essentially do anything because it was so muddy and wet, and then another game where nobody played,
Right?
literally
Yeah.
nobody played, right? And so you factor all those in, and the Ravens still scored 468 points last year, and no one seems to remember the fact that in the prior year they scored 531 points and they had the best offensive in the league. Everybody always is constantly gushing over Patrick Mahomes, as they should. Patrick Mahomes is a fantastic quarterback. He's got an amazing arm and does amazing things, but he wasn't the guy leading the team with the best offense 2 years ago. And you got a team that only scored 50 points less in the following year with all of the factors that we were just talking about. And it seems to me like expectations over what this offense can do, even if they just take a couple small steps forward this upcoming year, or even just, and people use this term incorrectly, even if they regress back to the level that they were in 2019. Because I think that my argument is in 2020, the Ravens underperformed, and that their baseline is probably better than what we saw. It's probably worse than what we got in 2019, but it's probably better than what we saw in 2020. And so the Ravens, in that sense, are going to regress to what I think is their mean in this upcoming year. And I think we're going to see another 500-point season. I'll be disappointed if we don't see another 500-point season this upcoming year.
So that's interesting. You're using regression basically in the opposite way of what most people think. I mean, it's a great point. I mean, having a young quarterback too, the numbers might not look as good, but that experience is invaluable. The mistakes that you make are invaluable. Lamar Jackson is going to be a better quarterback in 2021 than he was last year. Just like last year, even though the numbers don't say it, he was a better quarterback than he was in his MVP season. Things don't always go your way. So, and we spent a lot of time talking about the offense, but the defense side, I mean, we've ranked really, really high there too. We have the same defensive coordinator. We have basically the same personnel aside from the edge rushers. I remember talking to Ken McCusick about this. It's a very predictable unit that we added depth to, and I'm excited about the defense this year.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be understated that, the Ravens are returning at a minimum what you could consider to be 9 starters. And it depends on how you feel about whether Ngakwe was a starter when he was here or not. But essentially, the only guy that from my perspective, the Ravens really lost on defense was Judon. And so, there are very real questions. He's a lightning rod character. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know what it is about Ravens players, that everybody decides that they've got to be controversial about how they feel about it. I mean, speaking of the man himself, right?
There he is. Yeah.
But we've got Lamar, who's the second ever unanimous MVP, and yet he still can't get into top 100 ratings, on PFF. It's just this very bizarre set of things where the expectations should be there. But the Ravens are essentially returning everybody on defense, and the Ravens had major first year players, or at least first time starters, take on roles last year. We see that
Yeah.
from Queen. And Matabike, I think, is going to have a much bigger role in the defensive line. Elliott, I think, is going to get more comfortable in his second year. So you add all those pieces together and that continuity, and then Rob Ryan seems like he's really the right fit for Patrick Queen. Patrick Queen struck me as a guy that needed to be coached up more, and Rob Ryan seems to be, at least from what we saw in mandatory mini camps, really kind of right in the thick of it in terms of kind of getting into Queen's head and showing him what he needed.
I'll tell you what, and my one biggest fear with Queen isn't the coverage. I think that will come. If you were expecting him to be great in coverage in his first year, you were basically setting your expectations too high. But I wanted to see Queen play more physically. I wanted to see him be able to get off of blocks. I think Malik is actually the by far the more physical linebacker. I'd like to see Malik play the Mike more and have Patrick Queen chase things down from the will. Just think of the years that Peanut and Zach Orr had at will, and add Patrick Queen in there and his athleticism. Man, I mean, he might have 8 sacks and forced fumbles and everything else, but aside from that, I want to see Queen get more physical. And when you're talking about the personality fit of Rob Ryan, it's just I'm not there at practice, and we'll never know. But it kind of seems impossible not to play physical with Rob Ryan as your coach. So, man, it's a lot of great expectations. Just to sum it up, what are your overall expectations of this team in 2021?
I mean, I feel the same as I did coming into 2020, and which is very high expectations that the Ravens should be facing the Chiefs in the AFC Championship game or somewhere along the way in that sequence. I don't think any of Buffalo, Miami, Pittsburgh, Tennessee are good enough to stick with this Ravens team when it's operating at full cylinders. And if this team can, everybody says this, if this team can stay healthy, the Super Bowl is, I think, well within reach for this team.
Well, Jordan, thank you so much, man. Love
Yeah,
you.
thanks for
Football is family. We're gonna come back and we're gonna do another one. So thank you
yeah,
guys. All right.
thanks for having me on, Jason.